we can do that.
It's all good. Good? All right. Hey, everybody. Nice to see you all. Thank you for having me. I love the governor, and it's wonderful to have such support from the top, right? I go around the country and I meet with different places, and Strong Towns is a bottom-up movement, a bottom-up revolution. It really helps when you're not fighting the guys at the top. So you have a tough job to do. I appreciate the governor and his support. That being said, my job's to get us back on schedule, so. I want to start with this, the Great Depression. When we look back at the Great Depression, one of the things that we recognize is that there's not a consensus on what caused it. If you read a book about the Great Depression and the causes, you'll go through it. I've read many of these, and you'll read this whole theory, and you'll be like, well, that makes a lot of sense. And then you'll get another book on the causes of the Great Depression. You'll read that, and it'll say something the exact opposite of what the first one said. And you're like, well, that makes sense too, but these can't both be right. Nobody really understands even today what caused the Great Depression. Back then, they certainly had no idea. It was kind of a breakdown of this complex system. Even more importantly than that, nobody knew how to get out of the Great Depression. If we look at the whole New Deal project, it was an attempt to try many, many different things and see what would work. Ultimately, what got us out of the Depression, or at least what I was taught in school, and I think all of you were taught too, what got us out of the Depression? Right, World War II, right? As if global war is a great way to end depression, right? Let's send millions of people overseas to kill and to die. Let's take millions of other people, put them into work in factories, building ships and munitions and planes, and then, you know, let's ration gas, let's ration bread, let's ration sugar, prosperity. So if you're a macroeconomist, the Great Depression was ended with World War II. If you're a human being, we really didn't end it in World War II, we just transitioned to something else. The amazing thing was, as the war was winding down, it became clear to those number crunchers, those bean counters, those spreadsheet jockeys, economists that were advising the president, that as soon as this war was over, things were gonna get really bad really fast. There was nothing structurally different about our economy in 1945 than 1935. And so the economists assumed that once we brought millions of troops back home, demobilized them, once we shut down all these war industries, what would happen to the economy is we would just slide right back into Great Depression. Of course, that's not what happened, right? And we can look with hindsight and see that what we did is we embarked on this great American adventure to create a new version of this country. At the end of the Great Depression, at the end of World War II, we were the only country, major industrial power, not decimated by war. We literally had the gold. Like, we had been shipping everyone's gold over to us for decades, in the First War and the Second War. We had the world's reserve currency. We were like the leader of the world. We were pumping more oil, even without North Dakota, we were pumping more oil out of the ground than Saudi Arabia. We had a culture united kind of against common enemies. And we took all of this might and all this power into solving the existential problem of the day, which was how to stay out of the Great Depression. And in order to do this, we turned our cities into what could be thought of as a kinetic growth machine. A machine that would grow and grow and grow and create jobs and opportunity and economic development that would grow a strong middle class. Here's the amazing thing about it. It worked. It absolutely worked. We still nostalgize today, those couple of decades right after World War II, for how great they were. This is a map of Fresno, California. I want to walk you through this shift. I use Fresno not because all of us can relate to Fresno, they're kind of weird, but because you can certainly relate to their development pattern. It looks a lot like what we see in Fargo, West Fargo, what we see in my hometown of Brainerd, Minnesota, what we see in cities all over North America. Here's the boundaries of Fresno in 1897. Watch how this shifts over time. We go to 1909, 1922, 1934, 1946. What you've seen in these decades now is that traditional development pattern. That pattern, that kind of downtown Fargo and every small town across North Dakota was built around this incremental up, incremental out, incrementally becoming more intense, this kind of culture growing in a petri dish style of development. Very adaptable, very resilient, very strong, but not the kinetic growth machine we would create after World War II. Here at 1946, now we go to 1958, 1970, 1983, 95, and then finish up at 2010. You can see the pattern, the growth, massive, explosive amounts of growth. If the goal is, at a federal level, to increase GDP, if the goal at the federal level is to create transactions in the economy, this pattern of development accomplished that in spades. And even today, you hear the debate at the federal level, we're gonna spend, how many X trillion on infrastructure? What are we trying to accomplish? We're trying to create growth in the economy. We're trying to create jobs in the economy. We're trying to create opportunity for people in the economy. This is all about economic growth. And if we want to create economic growth next quarter, here's an equation that we created at the end of World War II that accomplished that. I think everybody in this room, and certainly after listening to the governor, we have a sense of the nuance or the trade-offs locally, because we don't value growth the same way that, say, a federal bean counter does, right? There's a different transaction that we do at the local level. This is some data that Joe Minicozy, who will speak later today. You're very lucky that Joe is here. He's incredible. Here's some data that him and I and his team put together out of Lafayette, Louisiana. Again, Lafayette is not Fargo, it's not North Dakota, but it does rhyme in many ways. A very conservative state, a very conservative city, very prudent people managing their government in a way that I think is amicable, is admirable. So we look at Lafayette at the end of World War II, it had a little over 33,000 people. Today, it's a little over 120,000, a 3.5 times increase. So a large amount of growth in a reasonably short period of time. But when we look at something like, how do the people of Lafayette get water? What we see is that at the end of World War II, it took 5 feet of pipe per person. Today, it takes about 50 feet of pipe per person. That's a 10x increase. What about fire protection? At the end of World War II, it took about 2.4 hydrants per 1,000 people to provide the people of Lafayette fire service. Today, it takes over 21 times that. So we can look at this and we can see that, yes, we're able to create lots of growth very, very quickly. But we do it by increasing the level of inputs. In the city balance sheet standpoint, by increasing the amount of shared liability that we all have. A city is a project of self-government, right? It's the kind of lowest level of self-organizing. When we run a city, we're basically appointing the president and CEO of our municipal corporation to run the city on our behalf as shareholders. It's the way we take collective action. Well, it's very easy to grow. It's very easy to add people. It's very easy to add population if we're willing to grow our liabilities by exponentially more than that growth. Now, there's a counter argument here. And the counter argument here is, okay, Chuck, I get it, but at the end of World War II, we were very poor. Now we're very wealthy. Of course we have larger homes. Of course we have more cars. Of course we drive more. We live a higher quality of life. We have a higher standard of living. This is America, after all. And I step back and say, well, where is that reflected in the data? Where does that show up? Because when I actually look at the wealth of families, it doesn't show up there at all. The median household income in Lafayette has only grown by 1.6 times. So we grow our population, yes, but we grow our liabilities by 10 times and 20 times, but our actual family wealth, when we look out at our communities, at the people who live there, they're not actually wealthier. In fact, in many ways, they're much, much poorer. This aggregates across an entire city in a way that is kind of startling, yet easy to grasp and understand. Joe is going to show you a bunch of these maps, and so I'm not going to go into great detail. I just have this one that we collectively put together. This is, again, Lafayette, Louisiana, where we did this very in-depth study, trying to help them understand why their city was broke. Why, despite decades and decades of robust growth, despite a real deep public commitment to creating new jobs and creating new businesses, despite all the economic development initiatives they had a massive backlog in road maintenance. They couldn't maintain their parks. They couldn't maintain the level of service that they expected. Why? And this map is kind of the culmination of that study to answer the question. This is a map of Lafayette. Every place where you see a parcel in blue is a property that is paying more annually to the city in taxes, in fees, than it requires an ongoing service. Every place where you see red is the exact opposite. These are places that require more over the long term to service and maintain than they pay annually in revenue to the city. I think everybody in this room can kind of quickly interpret this map. You've got the middle, which is blue, right? We know what that is. That's where you all work. That's where you all are doing the heroic work to make our cities strong. To the right of that, or to the east of that, there's a crescent of blue that runs through there. Those are actually some of the poorest neighborhoods in the community. I'm gonna say something here that may startle some of you. In North America today, when we look at cities, what we often see, and I'd say this is very true everywhere except in like the craziest, wealthiest cities, like a New York or a San Francisco, the poor neighborhoods tend to transfer money, tend to subsidize the wealthier neighborhoods. That's what we see here in Lafayette, Louisiana. Here's a sense of what those blue areas look like. So I realize when we look at downtown Fargo, we see a place that has really come alive and has done a lot of great things, and there's a lot to admire there. Grand Forks has a lot of the same kind of dynamics. I know my friends in Bismarck are here today. Yes, there you are, doing heroic work. One of our Final Four Strongest Town contestants this year. I love these guys. They do amazing work. But I want to speak to the other cities here. The Dickinsons, the Jamestowns, the Minot, the even smaller cities than that. This doesn't look like success in the upper right? This doesn't look like prosperity. This doesn't like have any glitz or glamour to it. But this place is killing it financially. It's doing amazing. It's actually supporting the city as a whole. What's all that red stuff out there? What does that look like? Looks like this. Looks like all that stuff you're used to. It looks like everything around this building today, right? The big box stores, the mall, the strip malls, the drive-through franchise restaurants, the windy cul-de-sac streets, all that stuff that we have come to associate with growth. There's two subsidies going on here in Lafayette, Louisiana. One subsidy is the poor neighborhoods subsidizing the wealthy neighborhoods. The second subsidy, and it's a much larger subsidy than that one, even though that one is not insignificant. The second subsidy is future residents of Lafayette subsidizing today's residents of Lafayette. Because as Lafayette has grown and taken on all these liabilities, what we can mathematically calculate is that in order for the city to maintain everything that they built, all the roads, all the streets, all the sidewalks, all the curb, all the pipes, all the pumps, all the valves and meters, the street lights, the treatment facilities, the parks, the transit service, the fire department, everything, in order to maintain that, taxes for the median family in Lafayette would need to go from $1,500 a year to $9,200 a year. One out of every $5 that a family makes would need to get sent back to the city just to maintain what they've already built. That is never going to happen. You all live in a place where something like that could never happen because you would never tolerate that happening. And so what that means mathematically is that those decisions that the city is making today that has resulted in their backlog of road maintenance going from 50 million when we started this project 5 years ago to over 100 million today. It means that that backlog, where they've called it a backlog or deferred maintenance, is actually just gonna become no maintenance. We're not gonna fix that road. We're not gonna fix that pipe. We're not gonna take care of that neighborhood. We're not going to live up to the promises that we made through our government to ourselves. Lafayette, Louisiana is one place. you guys, this is my people. You all, I live in the state next door to you. I come here and I talk to people and I'm like, this is my place. You are my people. This is not what we do, right? We're good, like prudent, hardworking. We don't want something for free. We don't want something given to us. We're not gonna, live high on the hog and just live for today. That's not who we are. That's what they've done in Lafayette, Louisiana. And in a great degree, that's what we've done here. I want to show you just real quickly the mechanics of what's going on here. Because once you see this, it starts to become something that you're going to see everywhere. I know a lot of you that are Strong Towns people are familiar with this. This is kind of the quintessential Strong Towns case study. 2 blocks in my hometown. This is in Brainerd, Minnesota. This is the kind of the older part of town, the more rundown part of town. 2 blocks, exact identical size, same amount of public infrastructure, same amount of public liability, same cost to the community to provide service and maintenance to these properties. 2 different styles of development. That block on the left, we call the old and blighted block. It was built in the 1920s. Kind of remember that when the city was run by these Scandinavian, very prudent people. They would grow the city incrementally over time. This was the next increment of out, were these 3 blocks. The people who built this assumed, through thousands of years of human history they've seen happen, is that as the city continued to grow, as the wealth continued to build there, as they continued to collectively together build this place, there would be enough demand so that those buildings would get 2nd and 3rd stories. They'd become more intense, more ornate. They would start to look more like the buildings a few blocks over in the core downtown, which at this point in the development of the city had turned into brick and granite, more substantial buildings. That was their hope when they built these 3 blocks. Of course, that's not what happened. What happened is that we built these, we had the Great Depression, we had World War II, and then we kicked in that kinetic growth machine. And we just started building out on the edge. We skipped right over this, and these blocks have stagnated for almost a century. That block on the right used to look just like the block on the left. We labeled it Blight, we had it torn down, and now we got the new Taco John's drive-through. I love being at a place where they have Taco John's because I feel like that's part of our culture. When I'm in Louisiana and they're like, what is Taco John's? I say, it's Norwegian Mexican food. And they do that same thing. They laugh at us. And I'm like, you have never had potato olays. Here's the thing about Taco John's. It meets all the zoning codes, right? It met all the building codes. It's got a new sprinkler system and an ADA compliant bathroom. These are great things. Like, I'm not arguing that they shouldn't, but this is like check boxes on our checkbox list. It has the right amount of parking. It has the correct sign to the sign ordinance. It has a little bit of green space. We actually put some native plants in a little stormwater area, so we get some green infrastructure. They put a block of sidewalk in there. The sidewalk like dead ends at the end of that little stretch you can see, but it's there, right? So in the future, we can extend that even further. If you go through the list of all the things we said were important in a development, this checks every box, every single one. Here's what nobody bothered to look at. That old blighted rundown block, you add those properties up together, it's worth $1.1 million. Pawn shops, liquor store, that kind of stuff. 2 blocks over, Taco John's, same size area, same amount of public investment in that property. Total value, only $600,000. The city is actually collecting 78% more taxes from that block on the left than the block on the right, despite it being dilapidated, despite it being run down, despite nobody really giving a damn what is actually going on there. Ask yourself the question. This is to me like the Main Street question. If we wanted to go out today and increase the wealth on that old and blighted block, we're not going to tear it down. We don't have the money to do that. We're kind of poor. We kind of got to, make things work with what we have. What would you do on that block on the left? There's a whole litany of things we could do, right? A little bit of paint, a little bit of elbow grease. You all are experts in this. You all know how this stuff works. If you want to make that block on the right more valuable, what would you do? There's people who dabble in this. They'll sometimes call it suburban retrofit. There's an urgency to figure this problem out because we know that a Taco John's like this is a 12 to 15 year building. You know, you all likely come from places where you either have buildings like this, maybe not that franchise, but a different related franchise, where they've, you know, the building ended its life cycle, they just closed it up. They've long paid for it, they amortized it out, they moved on to the next place. You know, maybe it becomes a used car lot for a while. At some point it gets boarded up and we're trying to get a tax subsidy to get it redeveloped. We've all seen this, but the reality is that the upside potential of this building is very limited. There's not much there. This is the systematic devaluation we've done throughout our core of our cities and out on the edge. And it's resulted in that situation where the kinetic growth machine has actually diminished the wealth and capacity of our cities. In 1997, I was in the Minnesota National Guard and I got mobilized to Moorhead because of the flooding situation. I had been to Fargo a couple times. I, as a younger student, was able to come here. I actually was going to go to NDSU for a while until my girlfriend at the time, who's now my wife, so that worked out for me. She has families in the Twin Cities and said, well, if you go there, you won't see me for 4 years. So I wound up going to the University of Minnesota, but I came up here and I was part of this community and looked at it and thought about going here. But when I was here for the flood, I got to spend time because for those of you that have been in the military, you know, there's a lot of like moving to places and then sitting and doing nothing for long stretches. Part of the flood was me sitting and doing nothing for a while. And so we went out exploring a little bit. It was very interesting. I think I can assert this without offending any of you, but I feel like 1997 was kind of a low point for Fargo, right? Certainly for Grand Forks, I don't think I would offend anybody by saying that, but I think if we look at Fargo itself, if you look at that as a starting point, there's been a lot of success and a lot of wealth created, a lot of growth in this area since 1997. We can think of that as like an inflection point. And I started out with the Great Depression because I want to contrast it to what you've done here. Because a lot of the national narrative about Great Depression was we hit this low point and then we energized our economy by creating a kinetic growth machine out of our cities. You participated in that, but only a little bit, right? North Dakota always struggled in that. The early parts of the suburban experiment were Southern California. Then, you know, air conditioning became a little bit better. It became Arizona, Texas. We went through a phase where it started to be the Carolinas, a little bit of Florida. You haven't really had your day in the sun, right? Metaphorically speaking, we have sun, but it's dang cold, right? And so it's been harder for us up here to experience the kinetic growth the way that they did in like the South and the Southwest. But after 1997, you, in a sense, embarked on something very unique. You said, we are going to now have our day in the sun. We are going to start to grow. We are going to put this thing back, and we're going to energize it in a way that nobody else is really doing. I want to talk a little bit about your kinetic growth machine. I want to start talking about your special assessment process. There's laughing in the audience. I don't. You do something here that nobody else does. I have been around the country. I have met with mayors. I've met with city councils. I've met with local economic development officials. I've met with people all over the place. I have never, ever experienced anything like what you do here. You've created one of the kind of, let's back up and start where I was on the last slide. I get why you did it. I get why in 1997 and in the years right after that you said, we need to invest in ourselves. We need to supercharge growth. We need to make things happen. I get that, and I think we can all look at that and understand that that took bold leadership, took bold action, and I understand what you did. But at this point, coming in as a neighbor, not a full outsider, but a neighbor, you have something dysfunctional going on today, and we need to talk about it. We need to talk about it. So this is the idea, if you don't know what a special is, this is the idea of a special assessment. The idea that the city would go out, take on all the bonding risk, take on all the development liability, to install millions and millions of dollars of infrastructure, hold that risk for the developer, and in turn then allow the developer to sell the lots and keep the profit. Other places don't do this. And they don't do it because I think they have a more clear understanding and separation between what the risk and what the reward actually is. You are taking enormous amounts of risk and getting, actually besides negative returns, no real reward for that risk in any way. Let's go through what this looks like. I call this endless subsidies on my slide. I made this slide last night just because I'm like, we got to talk about this. You take on, when you do a special assessment, all the financing risk. Developers have to go out in other places and borrow money. Like in other cities, they have to go out and do that. They don't get the infrastructure installed for them and built for them by the taxpayer. And then, if it takes a year to sell that lot, or if it takes 3 years to sell that lot, or 5 years, that's all money that's like burning, the developer's losing money when that sits and lags like that. Here, they don't lose any money at all. They certainly don't have any cash flow issues because you all as a public assume that risk. What reward do you get for that? What's your payback for that? There's no payback. You just assume it, right? You subsidize here in Fargo the first 24 months of occupancy. So for some reason, when people move in, you say, well, we're going to provide all these parks and all the police protection and fire protection. We'll plow your roads for free. We'll do all this. It's like a teaser to get people into a house. Why? Are we really hurting for growth that much that we have to do that? I mean, everywhere I go here, people are telling me, we're growing so fast. This is the place to be. Everybody's moving here. It's all crazy and exciting. It's never been so much growth. Of course there's tons of growth. You're like paying for it. It's very easy to create a lot of growth when you pay for it in this way. One of the more bizarre things is that in other places, when we do assessments, the assessment goes with the property. When you assess a property, what you are saying as a government is that we are, as a government, increasing the value of your property by a certain amount. And you are going to pay that cost because the collective group of us are not going to just hand you money. You actually have to pay that increase. If we're going to increase, if everybody in this room is going to be taxed to give my friend Kate over here $10,000, it would be beautiful, wouldn't it? You would go for that. But if we're all going to be taxed to improve her property by $10,000, everyone's going to say that's brutally unfair. And so what we do is if we increase Kate's property by $10,000, we go to Kate and we say, Kate, you need to pay that $10,000. Now we will finance it for you. We'll do all kinds of friendly things. We realize that, there's something here. But then when you go cash out and sell your property, you have to pay us back. That's the public side of this commitment, right? Not here. You just roll that over to the next home buyer. We don't care if that home buyer has a bad credit rating, is a deadbeat, is going to stay there for 6 months or 12 months. We don't worry about that because, why? Because we're growing so fast. It doesn't matter. All these mistakes, all these risks are covered up by growth. And if we can just create our own local kinetic growth machine, we don't have to worry about any of these risks that we're taking on. This was bizarre when it was described to me. I didn't believe it at first. And then beyond that, of course, we're taking on this long-term operation and maintenance liability. It's kind of crazy that your cities book this stuff as assets. We build a new road and we've got all this wealth now that we've created, as if a road makes you wealthier. It's the tax base adjacent to the road that makes you wealthier. The road is actually a liability. It's an eternal obligation. And when I drive around, because I walk around parts of Fargo, but for most of it I have to drive around. When I drive around, what I see, again, as a neighbor, and consider me a friendly neighbor, I hope. I'm not pretending to be an insider, but I'm not a distant person. What I see as a neighbor is a city and a series of cities that have an immense amount of spread out liability with hardly anything there. You've experienced lots of growth. Yes, yes, yes. but your kinetic growth machine is still in its first life cycle, and all of those bills are starting to come due in a way that I think is going to be really, really difficult. Beyond this, and I just want to throw this in as a kicker, the federal government subsidizes all of this too, right? This is the challenge of the downtown developer. This is the challenge of the neighborhood developer, is that those types of projects are not subsidized in the way that single-family homes on the edge are. Single-family home developers and commercial standard product developers on the outskirts of the city are the most subsidized developer in the nation. And here, you've subsidized them many multiples of that. They get bizarre levels of subsidy. And I think it's important for us to look at that, to understand that, and acknowledge that we, yes, are experiencing lots and lots of growth. We are paying for that growth. So let's not kid ourselves where it's coming from. I also want to say this, because this is another thing that I find just bizarre that is being recreated now in other cities across the state. Fargo is a very successful place, very successful city, and I get why it's a model for many of you to copy. But Fargo has created its own internal nonprofit engineering firm. And I think in some ways they would argue, and you could argue, that, well, that's very efficient, right? We don't have to hire consultants, we don't have to spend money on other things, we can do this all in-house, and it's very good. The problem is, I ran an engineering firm. I know the pain, the deep, deep agony that comes when you don't have enough work. Because when you don't have enough work and you're running your own firm, you have to look at your friend, your colleague, who has a family, who has kids, who has, commitments, and you have to tell them, you do not have a job here anymore. That's the most painful thing I've had to do in my life, running an engineering firm. But if you run a public engineering firm inside a department, and you can grow and grow and grow your staff on doing special assessments and projects, and you're short of cash, what do? Are you faced with the idea of letting your colleagues go? Are you faced with downsizing and those very painful things? No, what do? You just go do another project. You just come up with the next project to do. The incentives on this are all wrong. They're all backward. And I'm not suggesting these aren't very good, noble people. I'm not suggesting these aren't like my neighbors and my friends and fellow, North Dakotan, Minnesotan, good, wholesome Midwesterners trying to do the best they can. I'm sure in their minds, they're doing the best they can. But this creates backward incentives, really messed up incentives for us. Because we can look at the next project and we can justify it to ourselves as a really good thing that needs to happen, even when it's not the best thing that needs to happen. Final thing I want to talk about with assessments is this idea of assessing for maintenance. I'll go back to Kate over here. When we increase her property value by $10,000 because we go out and we do something new, we pave her street, we provide water and sewer, we do something that improves the value of her property by $10,000, we are allowed as a government from the US Constitution to assess that. But when we go out and we take an old pipe under the ground and we dig it up and we put a new pipe under the ground, and her property value doesn't go up one iota, because having water through an old pipe does not change your situation at all from having water in a new pipe, we don't get to assess that. That's not an assessable transaction. Cities, and this is not just here, but here, again, you've taken this to like a higher degree of art form. This is not legal. And cities do this all the time. They do it all the time, and it's really lazy. And it's an immoral way to run a government. Because if you look at the transaction from the eyes of the people in our municipal corporation, all those shareholders, all those residents, the people who own homes, the transaction that they've made is, I will buy this house, I will pay my taxes, and you, the government, will provide this service. And what we are saying is that, you know what, we're not running a prudent government that way. We're not actually having enough tax base to pay for all that stuff. So when we found that we're short of money, what we're gonna do at the end is come and hit you with a surprise bill. And we're gonna make that bill, and trust me, I've been on the inside, I know how these discussions go, we're gonna make that bill high enough to actually raise enough revenue, but low enough to where low enough to where it doesn't cost or it doesn't pay for you to challenge it. Because to challenge it, you have to go to district court, you've got to hire assessor or appraisers, you've got to go through all this work to do. We can run a government like that, and we can get away with it for a long time. Oh, eventually it will catch up to us because that differential will get so great between the money we can raise without people fighting us. But over time, that catches up to us. I'm gonna ask you to please don't adopt this practice. And if you're adopting this practice, try to find a way to wean yourself off of it. Because assessing for maintenance is the wrong way to do things. Now, I've had this conversation with a lot of local government people, and they will say, well, Chuck, okay, maybe fixing the pipe doesn't increase Kate's property value at all. But if we don't fix the pipe, and she doesn't have water to her house, her property value is gonna drop. So therefore, we're right in assessing her. And that has a feeling a little bit like this, right? I'm gonna make you an offer you can't refuse, Kate. I will fix your water and you will pay $10,000, even though it doesn't improve your property at all. Or I'll let your water go bad and then you don't have water and then your property is worthless. I don't think any of us here in this room want our governments to run that way. Yet we have set up the financial transactions where that's exactly what we're doing. I've got a couple minutes left. I want to talk about things we can do right now to start to address this. And everybody in this room is part of this action. We need our neighborhoods to be able to breathe again, particularly as you get to the smaller towns. But as we look to Fargo, as we look to West Fargo, these older neighborhoods need to be able to recreate and reinvent themselves. We need to allow the next increment of development intensity by right everywhere, always. If you have a neighborhood of single-family homes, it needs to be able to evolve to a neighborhood of duplexes and triplexes by right. There should be no regulatory friction to that happening. Along with this, there's a caveat, and I think this is a really important one, because as people who are involved in projects on the ground, there's always like the big shiny project we want to do, the big huge thing we want to do. And I'm going to tell you from experience, seeing these all over the countries, when you start doing these big transformative things, you grow your own NIMBYs. Like you actually like build them themselves, because they might look at it and say, well, that's an okay project, but not in my backyard. No neighborhood should experience radical change, but in exchange, no neighborhood can be exempt from change. Every neighborhood needs to be able to grow and evolve and change and thicken up over time. We need to lower the bar of entry. And I'm gonna give you a couple examples by what I mean to lowering the bar of entry. We need more people to be able to participate in building our cities. This is what my city calls a tiny house. My ancestors in Brainerd would have called this a house. For some reason, we have labeled this tiny, and we say, if you want to build a tiny house, you have to meet all the provisions of a house, plus you have to meet subpart A through M of the tiny house ordinance. You have to go genuflect in front of the council. You have to go ask permission from your neighbors. To build was essentially a starter home. This is the way people built houses for thousands of years around the world. They built something modest. When they saved up a little money, they'd put an addition. When they had a kid, they'd put on a second story. The neighbor would come over and help. They would go help their neighbor. This is how we build a community. Why have we made this illegal? Why does this freak us out? It shouldn't. We need to lower the bar of entry and let more people participate in building the city. Here's a commercial example of this. I see us going around putting all kinds of subsidies into building massive commercial buildings out on the edge with the idea that this will create jobs and growth and prosperity. The city of Muskegon, Michigan tried that. It didn't work. They did something different. They said, we recognize that we have all kinds of local entrepreneurs that lack the ability to participate at the level that we're requiring. They can't get into that big building. They can't sign a 24-month lease. They're trying to figure out how they can get their business started, and they don't have the wherewithal, the capital, to be a developer at the same time. And so they went out, bought up a bunch of storage sheds, painted them funky colors, put them in a gap in their streetscape, and they rent them out really cheaply to startup entrepreneurs. Crazy people who don't know they can fail, right? The amazing thing about this, they're always full of life, But the incredible thing is that all kinds of people have graduated from here with a proof of concept to a more substantial, more mature property. This is an entrepreneur incubator, and it's also great urban design. Last thing, we need to change our public investment strategy. I've talked about special assessments, we've talked about the big project, we've talked about the limitations of growing our infrastructure horizontally. We actually need to ask a different question now. It's not, where can we build that new road, where can we put that new pipe in, but how do we make better use of the investments we've already put in the ground? At Strong Towns, we've created a very simple 4-step process to making the lowest risk, highest returning investments that any community can make. Step 1, humbly observe where people struggle. Go out with humility and try to understand where people are having a difficult time using the city as we have built it. Step number 2, ask yourself a question. What is the next smallest thing we can do to address that struggle? What's the thing that we can do with cones and paint and straw bales to make this struggle that someone's having in our community just a little bit easier? Step number 3, do that thing. Do that thing right now. Don't hire a consultant, don't spend 6 months in committee. It's a small little thing, go out and do it. And then step 4, repeat this process over and over and over. If we can do that, we will not only be making the lowest risk, highest financial returning investments we can make, building our wealth and our capacity and our prosperity, but we cannot help but improve people's lives. This is a picture that my nephew posted on Saturday. That's Cole, he's on the right. This is my newest, he goes to NDSU now. He's one of my young nephews. I love this kid. He's an architecture student. I was meeting with some students yesterday downtown. They just happened to be hanging out downtown. And I asked them where they were from. They're from Alaska, Montana, Fergus Falls, Minnesota, and Bismarck. We talked about their degree program. We talked about their future. And I asked them what they wanted to do when they got out. Where did they think they would live? Not one of them said Fargo. Not one of them said here. They all had plans to go somewhere else. You're bringing amazing people here. You're giving them an experience, 4 years. This is a tough place to attract people from Austin, Texas, and Miami, Florida, and San Diego. They're all wimps, and this is cold, right? But you've got people here. They spend 4 years here. They like it. He's having a blast. He's never had more fun in his life. How hard would it be to keep him here? A lot easier than to get someone from Miami or San Diego or Austin to move here. I think the question that we need to ask today is not, how do we get that next middle-class family to move here out on the edge? How much subsidy do we have to give out? How much handout do we have to get out to get that next Applebee's or that next Walmart building? The question we need to obsess about is what would keep Cole Trottier here instead of moving back to Brainerd, where I'd like him to be, where we're trying to get him to move there? What would keep him here? Because the answer to that is something very, very different than what our programs are wired to deliver. If we do that, I think that next generation of growth is gonna make you wealthier and prosperous, and not only that, but create a community that we really wanna be part of. Thanks so much for having me here today.
Okay, we're doing the selfie.